paid user acquisition. It's not a half an hour topic. I wish it was. Nor is ASO, but I will try to go through and see if we can get as much of the key points for paid user acquisition as possible. So the agenda will primarily be, firstly, if you want to do paid user acquisition, Jan already touched on it. You should measure what you're trying to get at. Right? There are some, Jan went through a lot of different metrics, but specifically with respect to marketing and paid user acquisition, there are some details in that metric that I'm going to touch on. Okay. The other one is, I'm going to very briefly touch on. So if you're going to get users, you should first, sort of make sure that you're getting the maximum value of the users that you're getting. So very briefly, I'm going to touch on that. That's a whole big topic. And then we'll talk about how do you get users at scale, valuable users at scale. There'll be a whole lot of, you'll have to put together a whole lot of techniques, and you have to pay attention to a whole lot of things along the process. So we'll touch on some of those, and some of those will come up in questions, I'm sure. Okay, so if you look at this, this is a little bit dated, that ranks may not be right, and the numbers may not be right, but the trend is right? Used to be at one time, revenues and downloads actually pretty closely went along, not anymore, right? So it's decoupling. What that is an indicator as to the importance of actually getting right kind of users. It doesn't matter whether it's a game or an app. Some of this may say game. Some of them may be game specific, but a lot of what I talk about also applies to apps. If you look at this, firstly, you will have to measure the value of a user. How much do you get in terms of alternate payments, in-app purchases, advertising, and Jan put up that math equation up there. There is a little bit of a simpler version of that, even though if you're a very sophisticated user acquisition person, you'll actually go through that. Primarily, lifetime value of the user minus how much you pay to acquire the user is the value that you get. And if you can tip it to be positive, clearly you're buying $1.20 for $1, right? Or something like that, right? So you want to get it to that point. So you got to measure, you got to increase your LTV, you got to reduce your CPI. But most importantly, you cannot optimize for something that you don't measure. Right? Now, specifically with respect to marketing, let me actually go back one slide. So if you look at LTV, there is a challenge. Yeah, okay, you'll measure LTV, and you're actually acquiring users from multiple supply sources, ad networks, or Facebook, or wherever else it is. But your LTV pans out 30 days later, 90 days later, 180 days later, right? On ad networks, things are very dynamic. What you get out of an ad network depends not just on you. Depends on the other campaigns running at a particular time. As you all know, the seasonal effects of Christmas and all those kinds of things. It's not just CPI, it's also the quality of the users and the TV and all that. It also depends on the particular inventory available on the ad network. Right? So things change. You get a different kind of inventory that actually becomes a big part of an ad network, and your metrics change. Right? So if you're going to look back 180 days and say, oh, this works better for me than this, it's probably not too relevant today. Or if you look at today's users and wait for 180 days, it's too late, because what are you going to do between now and those 180 days? So that is why you look at the LTV and you create what are called leading indicators. Leading indicators is something that are guesses at what is likely going to be your LTV. It's kind of predictive model or whatever else it is, but it can be very simple. Take the example of Netflix, right? This is something that, in one of my past companies when we did that. So Netflix, when you get a user, within 48 hours, if a user watches 2 hours of movies, or places at least 3 DVDs in a queue, that's likely going to become a high LTV user over a 180-day period. They won't know whether it's really a high value user or not, but there is a very high correlation between users who do these two actions and somebody panning out to be a high LTV. So within 48 hours, you know if the lead or the install or the user that you got is useful or not. So you can be much more nimble about where you put your money, right? And you have to do it today. So creating this leading indicator, and actually for a lot of, not a lot, but at least some of the game guys, they at least do measures like 24 hours, 48 hours, 72 hours is the user coming back. That's somewhat of a weak metric, but you can do other things like, did the user complete a tutorial? Did the user go to level 1? Or what you do is you instrument your app and see what's the correlation between one of those actions and getting a high value user. So if you have actually done all these measurements, then you're ready for paid user acquisition. Of course, if you're going to do paid user acquisition, you can do, first you've already done your App Store optimization, right? And App Store optimization is a very valuable thing to do. They're free users for all practical purposes. But if you want to get at volume, in the end, you have to do paid user acquisition. You'll get some number of users through ASO, right? You have to have multiple strategies. Or you can wait for virality to hit, right? And by its definition, a small number of apps will be viral. The rest of the 99%, we have to work hard to get the users. So in terms of LTV of the users, I'm actually not going to, spend too much time on this, assuming you have worked on increasing the LTV of the users. First thing straight off, paid apps versus freemium. I can tell, I have experience in doing a bunch of different games which are paid, not as much apps. I'm sure apps is different. In US and international markets, it's very, very hard. Paid acquisition for paid apps is very hard to make happen. Right? You can spend anywhere, at least my history has been anywhere between $7 to $30 for a 99-cent app. And you're giving 30 cents in that 99 cents to somebody else. So it can be a very, very hard thing, right? So this is more so in games, right? International works better than US. It looks like people outside the US are more willing to pay. Actually, the phenomenon may be different. There are plenty of apps in the App Store, in the US App Store. So trying to compete there and make someone pull out their credit card right up front is hard. So freemium is the dominant model, straight up. Right? If you're going to do paid user acquisition with a paid app, a lot of ad networks won't take you, a lot of DSPs won't work with you, and our own experience has also been pretty tough. Okay. Now, once you're ready for that, you can do a lot of different campaigns, right? CPI. No risk. You go to an ad network, mostly ad networks will do this for you, right? You go to an ad network and say, hey, I'm going to pay this much per install. And how do you know you're going to pay this much per install? Because you know what your LTV is, and you've already measured it. Right? But it's not the end of the story, right? You're paying something for that install, but you have to measure the lifetime value of that particular source and tie it in, right? And see if the numbers are bearing out. CPI is no risk, but hard to get volume. So if you just stuck to CPI, you won't get volume. In the end, the reason you do anything is you want to scale. If you're getting 10 users a day, it's probably not interesting. So if you want to try more than CPI, right? CPC. There are a lot of ad networks that will do CPC for you, right? But from the click to install, the risk is still on the game developer or the app developer or whoever else it is. right? Remember one thing, like App Store optimization is a really, really good thing to do, but I've seen a lot of people do App Store optimization just to come up in the ranks, right? And their landing page experience is very, very poor for the users because there's all kinds of keywords that are not relevant. You know, you also pay attention from click to completion, right? So that's a very key one. Important in that process is to know roughly where you stand in terms of your what I call CVR numbers, right? From click to completion ratio is a CVR number, because if you know that number, that gives some idea as to how to back out into what kind of click rates you can pay and whether it will work or not for you. So in the end, it's all paying attention to these numbers. CPM, you have to pay attention to more numbers. It's maximum risk, but also maximum reward. Like Jan already gave some indication as to the kinds of things that you can do on an exchange. A lot of CPM is on an exchange. You can get CPM on ad networks too, but exchanges are a very interesting model for going out and getting users. And exchanges are useful for something else. Somebody else asked the question for Rita. I think we'll quickly touch on that. But CPM means you have to be willing to experiment and take some losses in the beginning because it's all experimentation, right? Doesn't matter whether it's an ad network or whether it is an exchange. So typically when we do a campaign, somebody comes and there are some, somebody comes with an app or a game. Of course, first straight up, you just want to see the size of the app. We got somebody with a 176 MB app. That straight away eliminates a lot of inventory because you cannot download anything other than wireless, right? You take care of the basics and then you start with the CPI campaign, get a little bit of better understanding. Then you do a little bit of CPC, get a better understanding, and then you go into CPM. Right? All of this in CPM, you have to pay attention to click-through rates and conversion rates, right? Constantly, right? Because the number that you get, in the first week may not be the number that you get in the second week, especially on the CTR numbers. Lots of things can happen: banner burners, redistribution of budget, all those kinds of things. Underlying everything is the notion of there is an affinity group for any kind of app or any kind of a creative. If you have already actually appealed to the affinity group, then you might have to move on, right, and create new banner, whatever else it is that you have to do. And here is another take at the complexity of all this. There is CPI, CPC, CPM, right? You have lots of supply sources, right? 100 plus supply sources. A lot of them ad networks. But the big one is the latest one is native platforms, Facebook being a giant in that. Right? We have seen 30 to 50% of Apple's, user acquisition, paid user acquisition budgets going to Facebook, right? It's a good one. You have to have a good strategy, and Facebook does certain amount of auto optimization, but that's not the end of everything you do. If you just did that, you're competing on a level playing field. You don't necessarily have the kind of advantages that you can have by doing something more. From just doing plain optimization to actually doing just letting Facebook do the auto optimization to doing something more, we have seen 300% to 500% improvements, right, on a dating app, for example. Of course, ad networks, big chunk of inventory in mobile is still in ad networks, and ad networks are willing to work with you on a CPI basis, CPC basis, taking the risk at least to a certain extent away. And there are a lot of ad networks that you can work with. Right? RTBs, you have to buy on a CPM basis. Bigger risk, but a bigger reward too. In RTB, if you can actually slice to the inventory that actually works for you, you can actually do very well. There are lots of things that you have to do. It's not just inventory slicing for an RTB to be. Then, of course, types of inventory. You have native. So native is very interesting because it gives you lots of good metrics. But the big challenge by its nature is when you do creatives for native, you have to do creatives that are native to that particular environment. So there are platforms other than Facebook that are coming up. So for Facebook has its own creative cycles. Then it has its own way of creating an ad. But it's a big enough source that you'll put that effort. But there are a lot of other platforms that are coming up like Namo Media and all these guys. Right. So they will be interesting in terms of native, but then doing creatives for each of those is going to be a task that you have to pay attention to and doing the right kind of creatives. There are other natives too. Yahoo talked about it, just talking about native now. OpenX has exchange inventory on native they announced recently. I just don't know the numbers yet. It's very interesting in terms of response rates. Some of the numbers that we have seen are completely counterintuitive to what you expect in a regular ad world in the native, in a positive way. So it's a good source. It's a good source. A lot of work to make it work beyond the level playing field. This is another very important one. Incentivized versus non-incentivized, right? So you go to Tapjoy and somebody can take a download and they get paid some virtual currency that they can use within the game. So you'll see two categories of people, right? One will say, oh, Tapjoy, cheap installs, right? Another category will say, oh, Tapjoy, lead quality. Same holds for Archie or Sponsor Pay or Supersonic Ads or App Circles from Flurry or any of these, right? It's never a discussion of price in isolation or lead quality in isolation, right? The discussion should always be what lead quality do you get for your dollar spent on a particular ad network. If you got 50% lead quality on an incentivized network, but you spent 30% as compared to a non-incentivized, would you do incentivized? You wouldn't. Right? So again, that goes back to measuring what you're doing. Video, there are whole video networks just do exclusively video like AdCom, OneLoop. Then there is a variation in this. There is an incentivization to watch the video, but not to install the app. But in that too, there are variants. If you go and look at some of the landing pages where the watch the video goes, it can get a little confusing. So if you don't measure the lead quality, you'll get burnt. Not all video networks are the same. This is a very interesting form. I have seen a lot of people overlook this just because it's more work, but it's actually very effective. Paper engagement, you don't pay for on an install because really the purpose of install is something else. So you actually instrument a little bit downstream after the tutorial is completed or after somebody reaches level 1. These are lightweight actions, but still you instrument downstream. You'll pay more for that, right? If you don't, you'll just drop off, right? In terms of volume. You'll pay more, but you're likely going to improve your lead quality. And a lot of this paper engagement comes out of incentivized networks. That's a really good way to make incentivized work. Then there's rich media, especially rich media, in some of the ad networks, but also on exchanges. You will pay a lot more on a CPM basis, but rich media also generates engaged users. So you have to back all this out, not in terms of what you pay, but in terms of what it does for you, in terms of quality, right? This is another very interesting one. I think somebody already asked this question. Retargeting. So if you have an app and you've been running campaigns for it for 2 years, you'll likely reached a large section of the affinity group for that app. Say it's 5 million, right? If you've already reached 3 million users, if you're going and trying things like CPM and you already had a large amount of user base who have taken your app, you'll get burned, right? So what you do is you do exclusionary retargeting using a DSP into an exchange. That means you load, and some of the DSPs will actually keep your data private, of course, just for your use. You load all your users into a retargeting DMP, and then when the bidder is bidding, right, for an ad impression, it doesn't bid on any of the iOS, IFAs or Android IDs or any of the users that you already have installed. So that means straight away you have eliminated out of your 5 million, 3 million, that means you're becoming more effective in terms of the CPMs. that you end up paying. So that's one example of retargeting. Jan and I were discussing some very interesting other examples of retargeting that you could do. So DFOS Media, just 2-second club. We are a mobile DSP which does all those retargeting and all the optimization and all of that. So that's it.